So, the Iran War of 2026 has been, and will no doubt go on to be viewed, as a very major strategic setback for the United States. Some have even referred to it as the US's Suez moment, given the outcome of course, in which Iran quickly proved that they had the military power to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, sending the price of oil surging and putting massive pressure on the global economy. The US did attempt to bomb Iran into submission, and did cause enormous and long-term damage, particularly to Iran's Air Force and Navy. But the thing here is that the Iranians proved that they could withstand it, and soon made it apparent that they had mastered a very new type of warfare. And of course they have a considerable missile capability. Mainly ballistic missiles, but also cruise missiles and drones too. And this puts them in a position to be a very real threat to the US presence in the region. Something which became ever more clear as they destroyed many US air bases in the Gulf. And the ramifications here are great. The US hasn't just faced a knock geopolitically, to my mind. It has, at least potentially, jeopardised its standing in the Gulf, having failed to protect nations in the region, and leaving US air bases in the respective nations destroyed. So, the risk here is that in the future, Gulf states may consider potentially re-evaluating their relationship to the United States in the future. And when you look at the meetings, and in particular the Memorandum of Understanding, it seems evident to me at least that Iran is in the driving seat, and that the US is backing off on a number of provisions to Iran's benefit. And not because they want to, but because the balance of coercive power has quickly come to favour the Iranians. So this is very much a moment in time to take stock, regardless of what your view on the conflict actually is. Because while the US is the major power in the conflict, they also appear to have had little control over how it actually progressed, which to my mind is probably the most interesting aspect of the conflict itself. As soon as it becomes obvious that the regime was not going to collapse, the US began to reconcile that their plans had not worked out. The people of Iran were not going to rise up alongside them, and the regime in Iran didn't look likely to collapse. So, given these conditions, risking a larger conflict was not seen to be proportionate. The strikes on Iran, including the strikes in 2025, will have certainly set Iran's nuclear enrichment program back, but the regime had survived. What's more, alongside this, Iran's belief in its need for protection is now stronger than ever, as they have now found themselves in an existential war, facing an existential threat to their existence. So, negotiations, of course, were never going to fix relations between the US and Iran, but they were a means to quell the conflict, and to at least stop it escalating. And it is true to say that both nations did take the negotiations seriously. The US was actually treating Iran as a serious player in the world, and this was because they knew they had to. But, as stated a moment ago, despite the US being the major power, they don't really seem to have a lot of control. It is ultimately Israel and their actions that initially would cast a shadow into the success or lack thereof of negotiations. Not least their strike into Lebanon, which marked a clear violation of terms, and an action that ultimately led to a second closing of the strait, which actually put the US negotiations in jeopardy. Interestingly, the New York Times would go on to publish an article on a plot by Israel to assassinate Iranian peace negotiators. Now, Israel had already been killing negotiators, not just in Iran, but in other conflicts within the region. But it is rare for such information to find its way into mainstream media, at least. One could argue it is just a necessity. The US and Israel's interests have converged in a very public way, and so it's just difficult to keep up appearances. But I think it is also true that there is a lot of concern within the US. The act of not only killing negotiators, but of also drawing other nations into the war. And so here I'm referring to Israel's action in Lebanon and the bombing of South Beirut, is very alarming. Ultimately, the US operates from a position whereby they seek Iran giving up their nuclear enrichment, and of course Iran doesn't want to. So there is tension there. But beyond that, what is important is that it does seem that Israel wants a lot more. And the implications here are very grave. The US may have gone into the war with Israel, but when regime change fails, the US, at least initially, starts looking for a way to actually end the conflict, while Israel starts to draw other nations into the conflict and escalate the fighting. The Finance Secretary of Israel has spoken on this matter. The idea that the US and Israel are allies on the surface, but that they don't share the same goals in the region. And that, I guess, is the major takeaway in the debate at least. And so it's little surprise that a split has become apparent between the US and Israel. And somewhat worthy of note, I think, is that this has actually taken place on Donald Trump's watch. He has taken the US into a war that his predecessor was pressured to start, but actually managed to avoid. And what's more bizarre is that when running for power, Trump campaigned very well against forever wars, talking of the US follies in the Middle East, and critiquing the special interest groups and lobby groups that provided the intelligence and push for the conflicts, stating he would not be bought off, and that under his leadership, unless there was a direct threat to US interests, there would be no new wars. Which, rhetorically for lots of people, was welcome news given the massive expansion of drone warfare, which by 2016 had arguably become normalised. But this rhetoric never materialised, and instead, interventionism, largely influenced by lobby groups, remained the order of the day. It is unclear how many of Trump's advisors were in favour of the war, but it certainly does seem that not all were enthusiastic. General Kane is a good example. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was certainly worried about US munitions at least. So there would have been voices of opposition alongside the hawks such as David Barnea, the Mossad, Hegseth, etc. Increasingly, people see the war as a consequence of the US-Israel relationship, because it does appear there is a lot of influence there. With the majority of the US House of Representatives, and every Republican bar 7, voting to merge the US military, a $1.5 trillion military, with the much smaller IDF. In essence, the 19 intel agencies become at one with Mossad. So this influence cannot be understated, as it does dominate US strategic planning. And it seems perfectly clear now looking back that the Iranian regime was not meant to survive. US air bases certainly weren't meant to be attacked en masse, and the inability to destroy all of Iran's centrifuges was not foreseen. So much of this has come, at least to a degree I think, as a shock. The bombing campaign lasted 40 days, and it failed. The US switches to a blockade, and that lasts over 2 months, and that also fails. So did its reintroduction. And as I touched on, when Iran asked for a ceasefire in Lebanon, and peace seemed possible, Israel bombs it the next day. So it's difficult to say where this leads long term, but the conflict has seen an unusual strain on an often firm alliance. And so the war has continued, and now highlights the different objectives between the US and Israel. What is sometimes understated, however, is how precarious things have gotten. High oil prices could quickly turn into fuel shortages, and so aside from the mass tragedy of war, the geopolitical consequences are grave. Douglas McGregor and John Mearsheimer have spoken at length on these issues, the back and forth that is at play. For example, the US moving military assets out of Kuwait and Bahrain and into Jordan, only to make Jordan a target when the US starts attacking Iran again. They also often discuss the changing rhetoric, such as the US threats to bomb civilian infrastructure, only for the US to very quickly back down when the Iranians retaliate. It is of course worthy of note that the US is also under considerable pressure from the Gulf states, and US prestige generally, but particularly in the region, has declined. But that being said, the US being in a war it cannot be seen, at least publicly, to lose, does provide another issue. So we have heard talk of ground troops. In reality, I don't really see this as a serious option, and in the event that it did happen, I just don't think it would work. I think most of us will remember LBJ and the Vietnam War. So in that conflict, when failure came, escalation was the cry. Mass bombing and ground troops. In the end, the US actually had over 500,000 combat troops in Vietnam, but nevertheless it failed. And so, as of now, diplomacy, something it could be argued is in short supply, is needed, and negotiation is needed. Events on the ground have continued to move against the US as attacks and blockades continue to fail. The US also seems to understand that escalation may be perilous. If I was to give an honest answer, I would say that there is no military option for them. Iran knows it isn't a superpower ultimately, but it also knows it is up against one. And this, far from deflating Iran or dividing the people and leading them to overthrow their government, has united the country all the more. So even the moral case for war, often the most emotive, increasingly rings false in the minds of the public. Regime change has been tried in Iran before, and elsewhere in the region many times, and has been a prescription for giant chaos. And ultimately, the war isn't happening as a moral crusade, even if that is the reason many support it. Iran is in the way of geostrategic interests. And the US-Saudi Arabia nuclear deal should kind of bear this out. It is an agreement in which Saudi Arabia is promised all the things that the US states that Iran can't have. And the nature of the regime matters little. But I think the real inflection is that many in the US are now questioning why the US is attacking Iran. It isn't a war that benefits the US, yet many in power did push for it. And in tandem with this, the US influence in the region is now also waning. Great damage has been inflicted in the Gulf. And on top of this, the geopolitical differences between the US and Israel have become ever more clear. So I think the ramifications of the conflict will be long-lasting. If anyone is interested in up-to-date analysis on the war, I would strongly recommend John Mearsheimer, Colonel Douglas McGregor, and Colonel Daniel Davis. They're always really interesting to listen to. So thanks for taking the time to listen to me. Take care.